The March rain pattered against the windows of the modest house in Bella Vista, like the impatient fingers of a destiny that wouldn't wait. Helena Cardoso, seated in the straw chair that had belonged to her mother, watched the drops slide down the glass like silent tears from the São Paulo sky. Her 18 years carried the weight of 3 winters of orphanhood, 3 years living under the reluctant protection of her uncle and aunt, Joaquim and Rosa. The simple blue cotton of her dress contrasted with the richness she had once known in her parents' home, before the yellow fever took not only their lives, but also the security of her world. Now, the delicate hands that had once leafed through French romances worked with a needle and thread, mending not just clothes but attempting to stitch together the pieces of a fragmented existence. Rosa entered the room with hesitant steps, her face marked by wrinkles that seemed to have deepened in recent months. The coffee crisis of 1897 had left deep marks, not only on the São Paulo economy, but on the soul of every family that depended on the golden beans to survive. "Helena, dear," her aunt's voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. "We need to talk." The young woman raised her brown eyes, in which a premature maturity, a fruit of the losses she had faced, was reflected. There was something in her aunt's tone that made her heart contract into a tight fist. Joaquim appeared in the doorway, his hat still on his head, raindrops dripping from his graying beard. His eyes avoided his niece's, like someone afraid to face his own conscience. "It's already decided," he murmured, the words coming out like stones thrown into a silent lake. "Carlos Mendonça, the coffee baron, has asked for your hand. The wedding will be in 2 weeks." Helena's world seemed to stop, as if time had forgotten to continue its course. The name Carlos Mendonça echoed through the halls of the São Paulo aristocracy like a legend, a 45-year-old man, a widower, owner of vast coffee plantations on the outskirts of the capital, a man who could be her father. Her relatives' words reached her like distant echoes, explanations about debts, about necessity, about how this marriage would save the family from ruin. But Helena could only hear the sound of the rain, each drop a tear she could not shed. I need time to think," she whispered, her voice barely escaping her lips. "There is no time, child." Joaquim's answer cut the air like a blade. "The papers have already been signed. You're an educated, intelligent girl. You'll know how to do your duty." Helena closed her eyes, feeling the world spin around her. In her girlhood dreams, she had imagined a different wedding, with someone who would court her with poetry, who would make her laugh, who would love her for who she was, not for what she represented or possessed. Night fell over São Paulo like a black cloak, and Helena remained by the window, watching the first electric lights come on in the streets of the rapidly growing city. Somewhere in a mansion in Campos Elíseos, a man she had never seen was making decisions about her future, as if she were just a piece on a social chessboard. Did he even know her full name? Did he care about her dreams, her fears, her hopes? Or was she just another commercial transaction, like the bags of coffee that filled the warehouses of the port of Santos? The wind howled among the trees in the backyard, and Helena wondered if it would be possible someday to find happiness in a marriage born not of love, but of necessity. The moon, hidden among heavy clouds, seemed to hold the answer in its silvery silence. And so Helena Cardoso's destiny was sealed on a rainy night, without her knowing that sometimes the greatest storms precede the most beautiful sunrises. The Hotel do Este stood in the heart of São Paulo like a palace of marble and crystal, a silent witness to the encounters that defined the course of São Paulo society. Helena walked down the carpeted corridors, her sea-green silk dress whispering against her legs like spring leaves. Beside her, her cousin Cecilia served as a chaperone, her curious eyes observing every detail of that meeting which the whole family was talking about in whispers. The hotel's tea room breathed elegance. French crystal chandeliers cast golden light on tables covered with immaculate linen cloths. The aroma of coffee mixed with the scent of roses that adorned the porcelain vases, creating an atmosphere that seemed suspended between the real and the dreamed. Helena adjusted her white lace gloves, a gift from her Aunt Rosa for the occasion, while her heart drummed in her chest like rain on a tin roof. She had imagined Carlos Mendonça in 1,000 different ways, perhaps a rude man, with rough hands and blunt manners, accustomed to commanding farms and negotiating like someone buying cattle, or maybe a distant aristocrat with a graying beard and a cold gaze, who would see her only as an ornament for his dinner table. "Over there," Cecilia whispered, discreetly pointing to a table by the window. Carlos Mendonça rose as they approached, and Helena felt her expectations crumble like sugar in water. The man before her had a natural elegance that transcended his well-cut clothes, a navy blue English wool suit, an embroidered silk vest, an impeccably aligned tie. His dark hair, only touched by silver threads at the temples, framed a face that time had marked with distinction, not with harshness. "Miss Cardoso," his voice carried a deep melodious timbre, like the sound of a cello in a silent hall. "It's an honor to meet you." The hand kiss was executed with perfection, neither too long nor too hasty, and Helena realized that his hands were soft, like someone who had known books before knowing the land. They sat down at the table, and the tea ritual began with the precision of a rehearsed dance. Carlos served the tea with measured gestures, asking about sugar and cream with genuine courtesy. But Helena noticed something more in his dark brown eyes, a silent assessment, as if he too was being surprised by the encounter. "I heard you appreciate literature," he said, after Cecilia had discreetly moved away to look at the gardens through the window. "Joaquim mentioned your passion for José de Alencar's novels." Helena raised her eyes, surprised. She didn't expect a farmer to know, much less appreciate, the subtleties of national literature. "Irachema makes me dream of beaches I've never seen," she replied, her voice gaining firmness. "And you, do you also read our writers?" A discreet smile curved Carlos's lips, completely transforming his expression. "Machado de Assis is my companion on lonely nights at the farm. Dom Casmurro makes me question human nature in ways that business never could." The conversation flowed like a stream finding its natural bed. They discovered unexpected affinities. Both had lost their parents young. Both knew the loneliness of large, silent houses. Both found refuge in the pages of books when the real world became too heavy. "Helena," he said, and the way he pronounced her name sent a shiver down her spine. "I need you to know that this arrangement is not indifferent to me. I know you didn't choose me, just as I didn't choose you for conventional reasons." The raw honesty of those words hit her like a cold breeze. "Then why do you accept?" she asked, surprising herself with her own courage. Carlos was silent for a long moment, his fingers gently drumming on the edge of the porcelain cup. "Because I believe that two intelligent and sensitive human beings can build something beautiful, even when the circumstances aren't ideal. And you," he paused as if carefully choosing his words, "have something in your eyes that tells me this conversation won't be our last attempt to understand each other." The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting golden shadows through the lace curtains. Helena realized that for the first time since she had learned of the marriage, she didn't just feel fear. There was something in that man, a kindness hidden beneath his formal appearance, an intelligence that sought genuine connection, that lit a small flame of hope in her chest. When they said goodbye, Carlos held her hand for a moment longer than protocol required. "I hope you will grant me the opportunity to prove that I can be more than a stranger in your life." As the carriage took her back to Bella Vista, Helena looked out the window at the streets of Sao Paulo and wondered if the man she had just met could, perhaps, become the companion she had never dared to dream of having. 2 days passed like leaves carried by the wind, and Helena remained in her chair by the window, watching the life of Bella Vista flow in its immutable routine. Street vendors shouted their wares on the cobblestone streets, children ran between the carts, and the world kept spinning while her own future hung like a ripe fruit about to fall. Her relative's house had become a stage for whispers and expectant glances. Rosa would come in and out of Helena's room with transparent excuses, sometimes to tidy clothes that were already perfectly organized, other times to check if the window was tightly closed. Joaquim avoided crossing paths with his niece, as if her presence was a constant reminder of the weight of his decisions. At the breakfast table, between sips of coffee with milk and silent bites of bread and butter, Helena made her decision. It would not be a decision born of fear or submission, but of the courage to try to build something worthy even in the most improbable circumstances. "I accept the marriage," she said, her firm voice cutting through the morning silence like the church bell cut through Sunday mornings. Rosa let out a sigh of relief that had been repressed for 48 hours, and Joaquim raised his eyes from the newspaper with gratitude mixed with guilt. "But," Helena continued, surprising them both with her determination, "I have conditions." The word echoed through the room like a stone thrown into a calm lake. In 1898 society, young women did not set conditions for arranged marriages. They accepted, submitted, conformed. "Conditions?" Joaquim repeated, his voice betraying disbelief. Helena straightened her shoulders, feeling the blood of the Cardosos a family that had once faced the São Paulo jungle to plant the first coffee trees, run through her veins. I want to speak with him personally, and I want him to know that, although I accept this marriage, I expect respect, patience, and time for us to truly get to know each other. 3 hours later, Helena was at the Hotel d'Est again, but this time without a chaperone. She had insisted on speaking alone with Carlos, scandalizing Rosa and eliciting resigned sighs from Joaquim. Carlos was waiting for her in the same tea room, wearing a grey suit that enhanced his eyes. There was something different in his posture, an almost imperceptible tension, as if he too had spent those 2 days weighing decisions. "I accept to marry you," Helena said without preamble, sitting down with the dignity of a queen taking her throne. Carlos's expression subtly changed, a mix of relief and curiosity. "But?" he asked, as if sensing there was more. "But you need to understand that I am not property to be acquired. I am a person, with thoughts, feelings, and needs. If we are to build a life together, let it be based on mutual respect." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Carlos watched Helena with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously vulnerable and powerful. "What kind of respect?" he finally asked. "Time to get to know each other, patience with my inexperience, and the promise that you will never treat me like a child or a subordinate." Carlos leaned slightly forward, his elbows on the table. "And what can I expect from you in return?" The question surprised her. Helena had expected resistance, perhaps condescension, but not a genuine negotiation. Honesty, the effort to build a good marriage, and loyalty. She paused, but loyalty that is earned, not imposed. A slow smile spread across Carlos's face, transforming his features and revealing a youth she hadn't noticed at their first meeting. "You know, Helena, my father was a very rigid man. He believed that marriage was a union of assets, not of people. I swore to myself that if I ever married again, it would be different." He extended his hand across the table, not to hold hers, but simply leaving it there, like an invitation. "I accept your conditions, and I add one of my own, that you always tell me when something bothers you, even if it's my behavior. I prefer the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, to the polite silence that destroys marriages." Helena looked at the extended hand, a hand that held her life as if it held a butterfly, with enough firmness to protect, but enough delicacy not to hurt. Slowly, she placed her own hand over his. "Then we have a deal," she said. "We do," Carlos replied, and for the first time since she had learned of the marriage, Helena felt that maybe, just maybe, she could find happiness in that improbable arrangement. The afternoon sun flooded the hotel's hall, and 2 strangers sealed a pact that transcended social conventions, the commitment to build love where there were only circumstances, to plant gardens where there was only arid land. Casa Alemã stood on Rua Direita, like a temple dedicated to European elegance, its windows displaying silks that seemed to capture sunlight and transform it into fabric rainbows. Helena walked among the racks of imported dresses, feeling like an intruder in a world that didn't belong to her. Carlos accompanied her at a respectful distance, observing her choices with silent attention. The saleswoman, Madame Laurent, a middle-aged Frenchwoman with a heavy accent and theatrical gestures, exhibited the finest fabrics as if she were presenting crown jewels. "For such a young and beautiful bride, I suggest this French taffeta," she said, unrolling yards of sky-blue silk that shimmered like a winter sky. "Or perhaps this Chinese silk, the color of champagne, which would enhance your brown eyes." Helena ran her fingers over the fabrics, feeling their softness, but her heart leaned towards simpler choices. Her eyes settled on a cream-colored Portuguese cotton, delicately embroidered with small wildflowers. "This one," she said, pointing to the modest fabric. Madame Laurent couldn't hide an expression of disappointment. But Carlos approached, examining Helena's choice with genuine interest. "You have good taste," he commented. "It's beautiful in its simplicity." During the next few hours, as they discussed sewing details and chose accessories, Carlos revealed aspects of his personality that Helena didn't expect. He knew fabrics, could distinguish between different types of lace, and showed an aesthetic sensitivity that contrasted with the image of the rude farmer she had imagined. "I learned from my first wife," he explained, when Helena commented on his knowledge. "She loved sewing and taught me to appreciate the art of creating beauty with fabrics." It was the first time he had mentioned his deceased wife, and Helena noticed a shadow of sadness cross his face, like a cloud passing before the sun. They sat down at the hotel's cafe for a late snack after the shopping. The silence between them had become comfortable, stripped of the tension of their first meetings. "Can I ask about her?" Helena ventured, distractedly stirring the sugar in her teacup. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the urban landscape that stretched beyond the window. Camilla, we were very young when we married. She was 17. I was 23. It was an arranged marriage too, but he smiled sadly. We fell in love almost immediately. Helena felt a strange pang in her chest, something between jealousy and compassion. She was delicate, fragile like a hothouse flower. When we found out she was expecting a baby, we were overjoyed. But, his voice faltered, both she and the child died in childbirth. It was a boy. The silence that followed was dense with emotion. Helena saw in Carlos's eyes a pain that time had softened, but not completely erased. "I'm so sorry," she said, and the words seemed inadequate in the face of the magnitude of the loss. "For a long time, I thought I would never marry again. The pain was unbearable, but the years passed and loneliness became too constant a companion." Helena understood at that moment that she was entering the life of a man marked by loss, who carried invisible scars on his heart. She would not just be a wife, she would also be an attempt at healing, a gamble on the possibility of starting over. "I don't expect you to replace Camilla," Carlos said, as if reading her thoughts. "Each love is unique, just as each person is unique. But I hope we can build something of our own, something that honors both your past and mine." The raw sincerity of those words touched Helena deeply. She reached her hand across the table and lightly touched his. "Thank you for telling me. This helps me understand." When the afternoon began to give way to dusk, Carlos accompanied her to the carriage that would take her back to Bella Vista. "Helena," he said before she got into the vehicle, "I want you to know that I admire your courage. It's not easy to agree to marry a stranger, especially a stranger with a complicated past." "Maybe," she replied. "It's exactly what we need. Two strangers brave enough to try to build something beautiful together." As the carriage pulled away through the streets of São Paulo, Helena carried with her not only fabrics for her trousseau, but also the first real piece of the puzzle that was Carlos Mendonça, a man capable of loving deeply, suffering intensely, and having the courage to try again. The Campos Elíseos mansion rose against the night sky like a fairy tale palace, its illuminated windows pouring golden light over the meticulously maintained gardens. Helena, wrapped in the cream-colored cotton wedding dress she had chosen herself, felt like an actress about to go on stage in a play whose ending she did not know. The ceremony had been simple, held in the neighborhood church with only close family. Father Antonio had blessed the union with traditional words about duty and obedience, but Helena had noticed something different in Carlos's eyes during the vows, a silent promise that transcended religious formalities. Now, crossing the entrance hall of the house that would be her new home, Helena admired the details that revealed the owner's refined taste. Paintings of Brazilian landscapes adorned the walls covered with French wallpaper, and jacaranda furniture coexisted harmoniously with European pieces. It was a house that breathed culture and good taste, but also a palpable loneliness, as if it had long awaited female voices to break its silence. "It's beautiful," Helena murmured, observing the Czech crystal chandelier that dominated the main hall. "It was Camilla's," Carlos said, his voice laden with memories. "She chose almost everything here, but—" He paused, looking into Helena's eyes. "I'd like you to change whatever you want. This is your house now." They climbed the marble staircase in silence, their footsteps echoing softly down the corridor that led to the main quarters. Helena knew what society expected of that night. She knew about conjugal duties, about the obligations a wife had to fulfill without question. Her heart beat fast, a mix of anxiety and curiosity. Carlos stopped in front of the main bedroom door, his hand on the doorknob. "Helena," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "I know this situation is a bit unconventional for you. I don't want you to feel pressured by expectations or traditions." She stared at him, seeing in his eyes a kindness that contrasted with everything she had learned about men's marital rights. "What are you saying? That we have time? That I prefer to earn your trust and perhaps your affection, rather than exercise rights that the law grants me, but that my heart rejects?" The room was large and elegant, dominated by a jacaranda bed with a white lace canopy. French windows opened onto a balcony that overlooked the inner garden, where the scent of jasmine rose like a nocturnal incense. Helena sat in the green velvet armchair by the window, still wearing her wedding dress, her hands clasped in her lap. Carlos loosened his tie and took off his jacket, but maintained a respectful distance. "Tell me about your parents," he said, sitting in a nearby chair. And so, on their wedding night, instead of performing rituals of physical intimacy, they talked. Helena spoke about her doctor father, who attended to both the poor and the rich with equal dedication, about her mother who knew the properties of every herb in the backyard and cured headaches with chamomile teas. Carlos shared memories of his childhood farm, where he learned to distinguish ripe coffee by its aroma and to read the weather in the colors of the sky. The hours passed like pages of a book being turned slowly. They talked about books, about abandoned dreams and secret hopes. Carlos revealed his passion for botany, showing her books on medicinal plants he collected. Helena discovered that he spoke fluent French and had traveled to Europe twice. "You know," Helena said when the living room clock struck 2 in the morning, "I never imagined a wedding night could be like this." "Like what?" "Quiet, respectful, as if we were building the foundations of a house instead of—" She blushed, unable to finish the sentence. Carlos smiled, and for the first time Helena saw in him not the mature, successful man, but something almost shy, almost young. "I believe true intimacy is born of trust, not obligation. And trust. Well, trust is built one day at a time." When they finally separated to sleep, he in the guest room, she in the main bedroom, Helena lay down between the embroidered linen sheets and looked at the stucco-worked ceiling. For the first time since she had learned of the marriage, she did not feel afraid of the future. Outside in the mansion's gardens, crickets sang a nightly symphony, and the scent of jasmine came through the window like a perfumed blessing. Helena closed her eyes and smiled softly. Perhaps, she thought before falling asleep, the best marriages were not those that began with passion, but those that had the patience to let love grow slowly, like the most beautiful flowers that only bloom in their proper time. The weeks flowed like crystal-clear water over polished stones, each day revealing new facets of the life that Helena and Carlos were beginning to build together. The Campos Elíseos mansion, which at first had seemed imposing and cold, gradually warmed with the female presence and the small rituals of coexistence that were naturally established. Helena discovered that Carlos was a man of quiet but constant habits. He would get up before dawn to walk through the gardens with a cup of coffee, checking the growth of each plant as a zealous father watches his children. She began to observe him from the bedroom window, admiring the way he moved among the rose bushes with delicate gestures that contrasted with his large, masculine hands. One morning, she gathered the courage to join him. "Can I come with you?" she asked, appearing on the balcony still in her nightgown and robe. Carlos looked up, surprised, but his smile was immediate and warm. "It would be a pleasure. But wear something more suitable. The dew makes everything wet." Minutes later, Helena came down to the garden wearing a simple blue cotton dress and leather boots. Carlos was waiting for her next to a flower bed where small green sprouts struggled to emerge from the dark soil. "What are you planting?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "Medicinal herbs," Carlos replied, his expert hands caressing the damp earth. "Chamomile, mint, lemon balm. I remembered you mentioned that your mother knew about healing plants." The gesture touched Helena deeply. Here was a man who not only listened to what she said, but also cared enough to act on that information. "She taught me a few secrets," Helena said, examining the tender sprouts. "This chamomile needs more space. And the mint," she smiled, "grows so much it can suffocate the other plants if it's not controlled." They worked together as the morning sun painted the garden with golden hues. Helena felt a strange peace having her hands in the soil, as if she were reconnecting with a part of herself she had forgotten during the difficult years at her relative's house. "You have a gardener's hands," Carlos observed, watching the natural way she handled the plants. "My mother used to say that plants feel when they're touched with love," Helena replied, "that they grow better for those who care about them." Their hands met in the soil at the same time, an accidental touch that made them look into each other's eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to that small space between their faces, to the scent of damp earth and the warmth that radiated from the contact of their skin. "Helena," Carlos said, his voice hoarse. "Yes, it's been easier than I imagined. Living with you, I mean." She felt her heart race, but not with fear, with something that was beginning to feel like happiness. The afternoons began to be filled with carriage rides through the streets of São Paulo, which was growing dizzyingly. Carlos showed her the changes in the city, the new buildings, the electric streetcars that were starting to run, the European immigrants who were arriving in search of a better life. Helena discovered that he had a progressive view on urban and social development, opinions he rarely expressed in the conservative circles he frequented. "The city is changing faster than our ability to understand it," he would say, as they watched workers building a new edifice in the central region. "But change isn't always progress if it's not accompanied by social conscience." These conversations revealed an intellectual depth that Helena didn't expect to find. Carlos read newspapers from different political tendencies, followed the debates on the abolition of slavery and immigration, and had well-founded opinions on the directions the country should take. Their evenings were spent in the library, where they both read in companionable silence, occasionally sharing interesting passages or discussing points of view on the books. Helena discovered that Carlos had an impressive collection of national and foreign literature, including works that many society ladies would consider inappropriate for women. "You can read any book in this library," he said one night, noticing her interested look at volumes she only knew by hearsay. "I don't believe in knowledge that's forbidden to intelligent women." One night, while reading O Cortizo by Aloisio Azevedo, Helena commented on the rawness with which the author portrayed urban poverty. "It's disturbing," she said, "to think that such misery exists so close to our comfortable reality." Carlos closed his own book and looked at her with renewed interest. "Have you ever thought about doing something about it? Can a lady of my position do anything significant?" "An intelligent and compassionate lady can do much more than you imagine," he replied, "if you're willing to." In the silent nights of the Campos Elíseos mansion, as the scent of jasmine came through the open windows, Helena began to realize that she was falling in love not only with Carlos, but with the possibility of becoming a better version of herself at his side. Tuesday morning dawned differently at the Campos Elíseos mansion. Helena felt the change in the air even before she fully opened her eyes. There was a subtle tension, like the electricity that precedes summer storms. Carlos had left early for the city, as was his custom on Tuesdays, to attend to business in the offices on Rua do Comercio. She was having her coffee in the garden, watching the medicinal plants they had planted together grow vigorously under the morning sun when Joaquim appeared at the gate. His eyes avoided hers, and his hands trembled slightly as he took off his hat. "I need to talk to you, Helena. In private." The grave tone in her uncle's voice made her stomach clench. She hadn't seen Joaquim in weeks, and his current appearance revealed a man consumed by worries. The wrinkles on his face seemed deeper, and there was something in his eyes that she couldn't decipher. They sat in the gazebo that Carlos had built especially for her, among the rose bushes that were beginning to show their first buds. The sweet scent of the flowers contrasted with the bitterness Helena sensed was coming. "What have you learned about your husband?" Joaquim asked without preamble. "What do you mean?" Helena frowned, genuinely confused. "About how he made his fortune. About the methods he used." The words fell between them like stones thrown on the surface of a calm lake. Helena felt a strange cold run down her spine, despite the morning heat. "Speak clearly, Uncle Joaquim." Joaquim sighed deeply, like a man about to carry a weight he would rather not touch. "I've talked to other merchants, Helena, men who have known Carlos longer than I have. He's not what he seems to be." The silence that followed was filled only by the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Helena waited, her heart beating erratically. Carlos built his fortune by buying properties and farms from families in distress during crises. He paid ridiculous prices for lands that were worth 10 times more, taking advantage of people's desperation. Helena felt as if the world had tilted slightly, altering the balance of everything she knew. "But that's legal, isn't it?" "Legal, yes, moral." Joaquim shook his head. "There are entire families who lost generations of work because of Carlos's business. Families who today live in misery because he took advantage of a moment of weakness." The words penetrated Helena like fine needles. All the conversations about social conscience, all the comments about responsibility towards the less fortunate, had they been hypocrisy? "And there's more," Joaquim continued, reluctant but determined. "I found out why he was really interested in you." "What do you mean?" "The lands your parents left you, Helena, those lands that seem worthless in the Campinas region, the railway is going to pass right through there. In 2 or 3 years they'll be worth a fortune." Helena's world collapsed like a house of cards touched by the wind. Her hands trembled as she tried to process the information. Had everything been calculated? All the respect, all the kindness, all the patience? Was it just an elaborate staging to get her lands? How did you know this?" "The same merchants. There have been rumors for months. Carlos has government contacts. He knows about the plans before they become public." Helena stood up abruptly, walking to the gazebo's balustrade. The garden she had learned to love suddenly seemed strange, the colors less vibrant, the scents less sweet. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked without turning around. Because you need to know who you really married, and because," Joachim's voice faltered, "I feel guilty for having handed you over to a man like that." The silence stretched between them like an abyss. Helena stared at the medicinal plants that Carlos had planted for her, wondering if even that tender gesture had been part of a performance. When she finally spoke, her voice was strangely calm. "Thank you for telling me, Uncle Joachim. I need to think about this." After Joachim left, Helena remained in the garden until the midday sun became unbearable. When Carlos returned late in the afternoon, he found her sitting in the library, staring at an open book she was clearly not reading. "How was your day?" he asked, lightly kissing the top of her head, as had become his custom. Helena raised her eyes to him, studying every line of his face, looking for signs of falseness that she might have ignored before. "Interesting," she replied. "And yours?" "Productive. I closed a deal I had been negotiating for weeks." The word deal echoed in Helena's mind with sinister connotations she had never perceived before. That night, lying in the bed she had learned to consider a refuge, Helena looked at the stucco-worked ceiling and wondered if it was possible to love someone, and at the same time discover that she had perhaps never truly known him. The library had plunged into the heavy silence of the afternoon when Helena finally found the courage to confront Carlos. He was sitting in his leather armchair reading business correspondence when she entered with determined steps that echoed on the jacaranda floor like war drums. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm but controlled. Carlos looked up, and something in Helena's expression made him immediately close the papers and give her his full attention. There was a subtle change in her face, a coldness he hadn't seen since their first meetings. "Of course." "About what?" Helena sat in the chair opposite him, maintaining a distance that suddenly seemed insurmountable. "About how you made your fortune, about the families you ruined, and about the lands I inherited from my parents." The silence that followed was dense as the fog that sometimes covered São Paulo on winter mornings. Carlos did not look away, but Helena saw something change in his features, not surprise, but resignation, as if he knew this moment would eventually come. "Who told you?" he finally asked. "Does it matter?" Carlos rested his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped, adopting a posture that revealed both weariness and preparation for a battle. "Yes, it matters, because depending on the source, you may have heard distorted versions of the truth." "Then tell me your version," Helena said, clasping her hands in her lap with a dignity that contrasted with the storm she felt in her chest. Carlos got up and walked to the window, contemplating the garden where they had planted herbs together, where she had begun to believe they were building something beautiful and true. "It's true that I bought distressed properties during crises," he said without turning around. "It's true that I paid low prices for lands that later increased in value, and it's true that I was initially interested in you because I knew about the lands you inherited." Every word was like a prick of a needle in Helena's heart. Even expecting to hear it, the confirmation still hit her with devastating force. "And the families? Is it true that many were left in misery?" "Some, yes." The raw honesty of the answer surprised her. She had expected denials, justifications, attempts to minimize the damage. Carlos turned to her, and Helena saw in his eyes a vulnerability she hadn't noticed before. "But you have to understand the context. My father died when I was 22, leaving enormous debts and a mortgaged farm. I had two options: lose everything or learn to be ruthless in business. And you chose to be ruthless. I chose to survive. And then, after I started to prosper, I discovered I had a talent for it, for seeing opportunities where others only saw problems." Helena watched him, trying to reconcile the man she knew, gentle, attentive, interested in literature and plants, with this description of an unscrupulous speculator. "And me? Was I just an opportunity?" Carlos closed his eyes for a moment as if the question caused him physical pain. "At first, yes. Joachim sought me out, mentioning that you owned lands in Campinas. I knew from my contacts about the railway plans. It was a business decision." The confession fell between them like a blade, cutting the thin threads of trust that Helena had woven over the weeks. "At first," she repeated. "And after that?" Carlos approached, but stopped at a respectful distance, as if sensing that any abrupt movement could completely destroy any chance of reconciliation. "Then I met you, and everything changed. How can I believe that? Because, he said, his voice gaining an intensity she had never heard before, 3 weeks ago, I refused an offer to buy 2 farms in Ribeirão Preto, farms that are facing difficulties and that I could acquire using the same method I've always used. I refused because I couldn't stop thinking about the family that would lose their home, about how you would look at me if you knew. Helena studied his face, looking for signs of a lie, but seeing only a painful sincerity. And my parents' lands. I've never mentioned them, never suggested that you sell them, never even brought up the subject, even though the railway construction is starting next year. It was true. In all the conversations they had, Carlos had never mentioned the properties she owned. Meeting you made me question everything I was, he continued. Your kindness, your integrity, they forced me to look at myself and not like what I saw. Helena remained silent for long minutes, processing the revelations. Part of her wanted to believe, wanted to forgive, wanted to rebuild the trust. Another part felt betrayed, deceived, as if she had lived a dream that now turned out to be an illusion. I need time, she finally said. I need time to think about all this. Carlos nodded, understanding. As much time as you need. But Helena, he paused, the man you've known these past months, the man who fell in love with you, that man is real. It's who I've become, not who I was. That night, Helena lay in her bed looking at the ceiling, trying to distinguish between the love she had begun to feel and the disillusionment that now consumed her, wondering if it was possible to love someone for what they had become, even knowing who they had been. A week passed like an eternity suspended in the air. Helena and Carlos lived in the same house as polite strangers, exchanging necessary courtesies during meals, avoiding glances that might reveal too much. The gardens they had tended together seemed like silent witnesses to an interrupted happiness, the medicinal plants growing vigorously in a cruel irony. Helena spent her mornings in the library, trying to find answers in the pages of books to questions that tore at her heart like thorns. Carlos left early and returned late, his business serving as a refuge from a house that had become an emotional minefield. It was on a rainy Thursday, when the São Paulo sky was pouring down in grey tears, that Helena witnessed something that would forever change her perception of the man she had married. She was on the library's balcony, watching the rain turn the garden into an impressionistic painting, when she saw Carlos cross the gate, accompanied by a simple man, a drenched straw hat, patched clothes, bare feet. Behind them, a young woman carried a child in her arms, both protected only by a thin shawl that did little against the storm. Helena watched, intrigued, as Carlos led them to one of the smaller buildings in the back of the property, a house she knew was empty. During the next hour, she saw constant movement. Carlos coming and going from the main house, carrying blankets, baskets with food, clothes. She also saw him talking at length with the man, gesturing in a way that suggested detailed explanations. When Carlos finally returned to the main house, he found Helena waiting for him in the hall, an inquisitive expression on her face. "Who are those people?" she asked. Carlos stopped, surprised to have been observed, rainwater still dripping from his dark hair. "Antonio Silva and his family," he replied, taking off his wet jacket. "They lost their farm last week. To me." The simplicity of the confession hit Helena like a lightning bolt. Carlos didn't try to hide, didn't elaborate justifications. "And why are they here?" "Because," Carlos hesitated as if the words were foreign in his mouth, "because I couldn't just take everything from them and move on. I offered Antonio a job managing one of my smaller properties. The house comes with the job." Helena studied him, seeing beyond the wet clothes and the tired expression. There was something different about Carlos, a subtle but fundamental change. "How long has this been happening?" "This is the first time," he admitted. "But it won't be the last." Without saying anything more, Helena went up to the bedroom. She lay down on the bed, still dressed, and looked at the ceiling while the rain pattered against the windows. For the first time in a week, she didn't feel just anger and disillusionment. There was something more, a growing understanding that she had witnessed something rare, a man genuinely trying to redeem himself from his past. The next morning she found Carlos in the garden, tending to the medicinal plants they had planted together. He didn't see her approach, focused on examining the chamomile sprouts that were beginning to show their first flowers. "They're growing well," Helena said, kneeling beside him. Carlos looked up, surprised but cautious. "Yes, your hands have a special touch with plants." They worked in silence for a few minutes, their hands occasionally touching as they cared for the soil. Helena felt the tension of the previous week begin to dissipate like morning mist. "I spoke with Antonio yesterday," she finally said. Carlos stopped working, waiting. He told me how you treated him, how you explained that the farm had structural problems that would require investments he couldn't make, how you offered not only a job but also help for his children to continue their studies. Helena, let me finish, she interrupted him softly. He also told me that you apologized, that you admitted that in the past you wouldn't have cared about his family's fate. Carlos turned his attention back to the plants, his hands slightly trembling as he fluffed the soil around a mint seedling. Because it's true, the man I was wouldn't have cared. Helena sat on her heels watching him. The morning sun filtered through the leaves of the trees, creating a play of light and shadow on Carlos's dark hair. What changed? You, he said, without hesitation. Living with you, seeing the world through your eyes, understanding that there's a different way to be a man, to have power, to use wealth. There was a raw vulnerability in his voice that touched Helena deeply. I can't undo what I did in the past, Carlos continued, but I can choose to be different from now on. And I choose this not because you expect it of me, but because it's who I want to be now. Helena reached out and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble against her palm. I forgive you, she said, and the words came out like a release, not just for him, but for herself. Carlos closed his eyes, resting his face against her hand. I don't deserve your forgiveness. No one deserves forgiveness, Helena replied. That's why it's a gift, not a debt. When Carlos opened his eyes, Helena saw tears there, tears of gratitude, of relief, of something that seemed like a rebirth. I love you, he said, and they were the first words of true love exchanged between them. I love you too, Helena replied, and for the first time since they had married, she was sure that she loved not only the man Carlos was now, but also the courage he showed in changing. That morning, among medicinal plants and soil damp with dew, two wounded hearts found healing in mutual forgiveness, and an arranged marriage finally transformed into the true love they had both secretly hoped to find. 3 months had passed since the reconciliation, and Helena watched the workers carry the last pieces of furniture to the carriage that would take them to their new house in Higienopolis. The Campos Elíseos mansion, with all its grandeur, had become heavy with memories, some sweet, some bitter, all part of a phase that was now coming to an end. Carlos appeared beside her, his face slightly sweaty from the effort of supervising the move. Are you having second thoughts? He asked, noticing Helena's pensive expression. No, she replied, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. This house has the past. The new one will have our future. The house in Higienopolis was smaller, but had a charm that the previous mansion never had. In an eclectic style, it combined neoclassical elements with Art Nouveau details that were becoming fashionable in a rapidly growing São Paulo. The garden was more modest but received better sunlight, promising to be perfect for the medicinal herbs Helena had learned to cultivate. During the journey through the streets of São Paulo, Helena watched the city transform before her eyes. New buildings appeared like mushrooms after the rain, electric streetcars crossed newly opened avenues, and immigrants of various nationalities walked on the sidewalks carrying dreams and hopes in their simple bags. The city is changing so quickly, she commented. Like us, Carlos replied, taking her hand. Sometimes change is scary but necessary. The new house welcomed them with the aroma of fresh paint and new wood. The rooms were smaller but cozier. The larger windows allowed natural light to flood every room, and there was a general sense of new beginnings that enveloped Helena like a warm hug. In the main bedroom, Carlos had prepared a surprise. On the jacaranda dresser, in a worked silver frame, was a photograph of Helena's parents, the only one she had, which she kept like a treasure in a drawer at her relative's house. How did you get this? She asked, delicately touching the glass that protected the image. I asked Joachim. I thought they should be here, blessing our new life. The tears that ran down Helena's face were sweet, different from the bitter tears she had shed during the crisis. They were tears of gratitude, of love, of hope. Thank you, she whispered. This means more than you can imagine. Carlos wrapped her in his arms, and she let herself be embraced, feeling for the first time that she was truly at home, not in the house, but in the arms of that man who had learned to love her imperfections and was trying to become worthy of the love she offered him. They spent the afternoon arranging the rooms, deciding where each piece of furniture would look best, discussing colors for the curtains and plants for the garden. It was a simple domestic task, but Helena felt in it the beauty of building a future with two hands. I want to turn one of the smaller rooms into a library, Carlos said, but this time we'll choose the books together. And I'd like to have a small laboratory to prepare herbal medicines, Helena added. Nothing elaborate, just a place where I can apply what my mother taught me. They had dinner in the dining room lit by candles, simple food served on a table that still smelled of fresh varnish. Through the open windows came the sounds of the city, horse hooves on the cobblestone streets, distant conversations of neighbors, the whistle of some distant train carrying dreams to unknown destinations. Helena, Carlos said, reaching his hand across the table, I want you to know that this house represents more than a change of address for me. What does it represent? It represents leaving behind the man I was and fully embracing the man you helped me become. Helena intertwined her fingers with his, feeling the strength and softness of those hands that had learned to plant instead of just possess. And for me, it represents having found not just a husband, but a true life companion. That night they lay in the new bed, in the new room, listening to the different sounds of the different neighborhood. Helena snuggled against Carlos's chest, feeling his heartbeat at a calm and steady rhythm. You know, she murmured on the verge of falling asleep, I think my parents would approve. You think so? I'm sure. They always said that true love isn't finding someone perfect, but finding someone imperfect and choosing to love them anyway. Carlos kissed the top of her head, inhaling the delicate scent of her hair. Then we're perfect for each other in our imperfection. And so in a new house in Higienopolis, as São Paulo grew around them in a symphony of progress and hope, Helena and Carlos truly began their married life, no longer a convenient arrangement, but a daily choice to build love, respect, and companionship. A month had passed since the move to Higienopolis, and the house was beginning to take on the personality of its inhabitants. Helena had transformed the small backyard garden into a natural laboratory, where she cultivated not only medicinal herbs, but also flowers that perfumed the mornings with sweet and delicate scents. Carlos had created an office where he conducted his reformed businesses, now focusing on partnerships that benefited small producers instead of exploiting them. The nights became rituals of growing intimacy, not the physical intimacy that society expected from couples, but something deeper. Conversations that extended late into the night, shared silences as they read side by side, small gestures of affection that arose naturally, without haste or pressure. It was a particularly warm December night when Helena made a decision that would forever change the dynamic of her marriage. Carlos was on the balcony, contemplating the garden under the silvery light of the full moon, when she approached him wearing only a white cotton nightgown that reached her ankles. The thin fabric revealed the delicate curves of her body, and for the first time since the wedding she felt no shyness or fear, only a quiet certainty that she was ready. Carlos, she said softly, touching his shoulder. He turned, and Helena saw surprise give way to something deeper in his eyes when he realized her intentions. All those months, he had completely respected her need for time, never pressuring, never demanding, always waiting for her to take the initiative. Are you sure? He asked, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. I am, Helena replied, and there was a quiet strength in her voice he hadn't heard before. I'm ready, not out of obligation or duty, but because I want to, because I love you. Carlos extended his hand and she took it, allowing him to guide her back to the bedroom. He lit only one candle, creating a soft, welcoming light that danced on the cream-painted walls. What happened between them that night was different from everything Helena had imagined. She had heard whispers from married women about pain, about submission, about conjugal duties fulfilled with resignation. But she discovered something completely different. She discovered that physical intimacy, when born of true love and mutual respect, could be as beautiful as a symphony played in perfect harmony. Carlos treated her with a delicacy that bordered on reverence, his hands exploring her body like someone touching a precious work of art, always attentive to her signals, always ensuring she felt safe and loved. There was no haste, no imposition, just two human beings discovering together the silent language of bodies that love each other. Helena discovered that she had her own language to express love, the touch of her hands in Carlos's dark hair, the way she arched her body in response to his caresses, the small sounds of pleasure that escaped her lips like intimate music. When they finally joined completely, it was as if two halves of the same soul found their perfect fit. Helena felt a connection that transcended the physical. It was as if every cell in her body recognized and celebrated his presence. Afterward, they remained embraced in the darkness, perfumed by the slowly burning candle, their bodies still intertwined, their breathing gradually returning to a normal rhythm. Are you okay? Carlos asked, gently kissing her neck. "I'm perfect," Helena replied, and there was an absolute truth in those words. They talked softly until the candle went out. Confidences whispered in the intimacy of the darkness. Helena told him about the fears she had faced, about how she had imagined that moment, about how reality had surpassed all her expectations. Carlos shared his own vulnerability, confessing how he had feared not being able to make himself loved by her, how every gesture of affection she offered him was an unexpected gift, not for accepting the marriage, but for choosing to love me. "Thank you," she replied, snuggling deeper into his arms, "for showing me that love can grow slowly, like the most beautiful plants, that take time to bloom, but when they do, are the most enduring." They fell asleep together for the first time since the wedding, and Helena felt that she had finally found her place in the world, not just as Carlos Mendonca's wife, but as Helena, a loved and respected woman, a chosen and cherished companion. "Helena," he said as sleep began to claim them, "thank you for choosing me." The next morning, when they woke up with the first rays of sun flooding the room, both knew that they had crossed an irreversible border, forever transforming an arranged marriage into the true and complete love they had both secretly hoped to find. 6 months had passed since Helena and Carlos had become truly husband and wife, and life in the Higienopolis house had established a rhythm that they had both learned to love. The mornings began with coffee taken in the garden, where Helena's medicinal herbs grew vigorously, and the flowers Carlos had planted for her painted, multicolored flower beds. Carlos had fulfilled his promise of change. His businesses now included a cooperative that helped small coffee producers get better prices for their harvests, a fund to assist families facing financial difficulties, and investments in education for the children of rural workers. The transformation had not been just moral but also profitable. He had discovered that doing good could also be good business. Helena had found her own mission. 2 mornings a week, she visited an orphanage in central São Paulo, where she taught literacy to children who would otherwise never have access to education. On Saturdays, she received women from the neighborhood interested in learning about medicinal plants and basic healthcare at home. It was a particularly hot February afternoon when Helena noticed the first signs that her life was about to change again. Sitting in the library trying to concentrate on reading a book about child pedagogy, she felt a wave of nausea that forced her to run to the backyard in search of fresh air. Over the following weeks, the signs intensified. The aroma of morning coffee, which had always been a pleasure, became unbearable. Certain foods she enjoyed now made her nauseous, and there was also a different kind of tiredness, a drowsiness that came without warning. Helena knew the signs. She had observed many women go through the same experience during her childhood when she accompanied her mother on her medical care visits, but she preferred to be sure before sharing her suspicions. One morning in March, while Carlos was on a business trip to the interior, Helena discreetly visited Dr. Henrique Monteiro, the family doctor who had cared for her during a fever a few months earlier. The doctor's office was in an elegant house on Rua do Carmo, and Helena waited nervously in the waiting room, flipping through a French magazine without being able to concentrate on the pages. "My congratulations, Donna Helena," the doctor said, after a careful examination. "You are expecting a baby. From what I can calculate, it should be born at the end of October." The confirmation brought a mix of joy, anxiety, and emotion that Helena had never experienced. Her hands instinctively moved to her womb, where a new life was beginning to take shape. During the trip back home, Helena planned how she would tell Carlos the news. She wanted it to be special, a moment they would both remember forever. Carlos returned from his trip on a rainy Thursday, finding Helena in the garden despite the light drizzle. She was kneeling by the herb flower bed, but there was something different about her posture, a new serenity that he noticed immediately. "How was the trip?" she asked, getting up to greet him with a kiss. "Productive. The cooperative is working better than we expected. And you? How have you been these past few days?" Helena smiled in a mysterious way that piqued his curiosity. "Very well. In fact, I have some news for you." Carlos raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "What kind of news?" Instead of answering with words, Helena led him to the flower bed, where she grew herbs for calming and digestive teas. There, among the already established plants, was a small green and delicate fennel seedling. "I planted this today," she said, "a special herb, which they say is very good for mothers who are expecting babies." Carlos looked at the seedling, then at Helena, then back at the plant, his brain slowly processing what she was hinting at. "Helena, are you saying that—" "I'm saying that in October we'll have one more person in our family." For a moment, Carlos seemed paralyzed. Then, his face transformed into an expression of joy so pure and intense that it made Helena laugh with happiness. "A baby," he repeated, as if the words were foreign on his tongue. "A baby," she confirmed. Carlos wrapped her in his arms, spinning her gently, already careful with the precious cargo she carried. When he set her on the ground, there were tears in his eyes. "I thought I'd never. After Camilla," his voice failed. "Everything will be all right," Helena said, touching his face. "We are older, wiser, and we have a love that can overcome any fear." That night, they had dinner with a silent joy, making plans for the future, discussing names, imagining what this new person would be like. Carlos already showed a touching, protective instinct, insisting that Helena sit in the most comfortable armchair, bringing her extra pillows, checking if she was cold or warm. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Helena said, watching his exaggerated care with tenderness. "I want to be," he replied. "I want to be the father I never had the chance to be before." That night, as Helena fell asleep nestled in Carlos's arms, one of his hands resting protectively on her still unchanged belly, they both felt that their lives had found an even greater purpose, not just to love each other, but to create and nurture a new life that would be the fruit of that love, one with patience and built with truth. The months of pregnancy brought an emotional intensity that Carlos had never experienced. Every change in Helena's body, every new stage of the baby's development, awakened in him a mix of radiant joy and primitive terror. The memories of the tragedy with Camilla haunted his nights like ghosts reluctant to leave. Helena had noticed his fears since the first weeks. She saw them in the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way his hands trembled slightly, when he touched her growing belly, in the tension that would seize his features whenever she mentioned a typical discomfort of gestation. It was a July night when Helena was 6 months pregnant that the issue finally came to the surface. She had spent the day feeling the baby move vigorously, and she wanted to share the joy of those sensations with Carlos. She found him in the library, pretending to read, but with his gaze lost in the flames of the fireplace. "Carlos," she said, sitting next to him on the sofa, "give me your hand." He obeyed, and she guided his palm to the side of her belly, where the baby was particularly active that night. "Do you feel it?" she whispered, when a small protrusion moved under her skin. Carlos felt the movement, and his expression transformed into a mix of wonder and panic. He withdrew his hand as if he had touched something that burned. "I'm sorry," he murmured. You're scared," Helena completed, her voice gentle but firm. "Scared of losing me like you lost Camilla." The silence that followed was filled only by the crackling of the flames in the fireplace. Carlos rested his elbows on his knees, his face in his hands. "I can't help it," he confessed. "Every day that passes, you get more beautiful, more radiant, and I get more terrified. What if something goes wrong? What if I lose you too?" Helena studied the profile of the man she loved, seeing in him not the successful and confident farmer the world knew, but a man wounded by the past, trying to find the courage to face the future. "Look at me," she said softly. Carlos raised his eyes, and Helena saw a vulnerability there that touched her deeply. "I am not Camila. I am older, stronger. We have better doctors, better care. And most important of all," she took his face in her hands, "I know you wouldn't be able to bear losing me, so I'm going to fight with all my might to stay here with you and with our child." "But what if we succeed?" Helena interrupted him. "What if everything goes well? What if in a few months we are here in this same room with our baby in our arms, laughing at our fears today?" Helena stood up and held out her hand to Carlos. "Come with me." She led him to the room they had prepared for the baby. It was a small but cozy room, with walls painted in a soft yellow light wood furniture and white cotton curtains that filtered the light delicately. Carlos had built the crib with his own hands, working on nights when he couldn't sleep. "This room," Helena said, "represents our hope. Every piece we chose, every detail we planned, is an act of faith in the future." Carlos looked at the environment they had created together, and Helena saw something soften in his expression. "Do you want to feel the baby move again?" she asked. This time, when Carlos put his hand on her belly, he didn't pull away when he felt the movement. Instead, he let his palm rest there, as if he were blessing the life that was growing inside her. "Talk to him," Helena encouraged. "What should I say?" "Whatever your heart tells you." Carlos was silent for a long moment, then began to speak softly. "Hello, little one. I'm your dad. I know you haven't been born yet, but I already love you more than I thought was possible. I'm scared, I confess. Scared of not being a good father, scared that something will go wrong. But I promise I will take care of you and your mother with all my strength. The baby moved again as if responding to its father's words, and Carlos smiled, the first genuine smile Helena had seen in weeks. I think he liked your voice, she said. Or she, it could be a girl. That would be wonderful too. They spent the rest of the night talking about names, about what it would be like to raise a child in those changing times, about the values they wanted to pass on. And for the first time since she had learned of the pregnancy, Helena saw Carlos truly relax, allowing himself to imagine a future where happiness outweighed fears. 3 months later, on a golden October morning, Helena felt the first contractions. Carlos, who had hired São Paulo's best obstetrician and an experienced midwife, turned into an efficiently nervous mannequin, ensuring that everything was ready, that all precautions were taken. The labor lasted 16 hours, and throughout that time Carlos stayed by Helena's side, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, being the anchor of strength she needed. When the baby's loud and healthy cry finally echoed through the room, Carlos cried too, tears of relief, of gratitude, of overflowing love. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, placing the clean child wrapped in a blanket in Helena's arms. Carlos looked at his son, small, perfect, with tiny fingers clutching at the air, and felt his heart expand in a way he didn't know was possible. "Pedro," Helena said, looking at the baby with infinite tenderness. "Our Pedro." That October afternoon in 1899, as he held his son in his arms and watched Helena sleeping with a serene smile on her face, Carlos finally understood that true love was not the absence of fear, but the courage to love in spite of it. 5 years had passed like the pages of a well-loved book, each marked by small daily miracles and great silent transformations. The house in Higienopolis had grown with the family, not in size, but in life, in laughter, in memories that accumulated like perfumed petals in every room. It was a golden morning in 1904, and Helena, now 24, watched from the living room window as Pedro played in the garden under Carlos's attentive supervision. The 5-year-old boy had inherited his mother's brown eyes and his father's dark hair, but he had a unique personality, curious as a scientist, gentle as a poet, and determined as a little general when he wanted something. "Dad, why is this flower yellow and that one red?" Pedro asked, pointing to the different varieties of roses that Carlos cultivated with passion. "Because each plant carries within it special instructions, like secret recipes that determine its colors," Carlos explained, kneeling beside his son. "It's like you having your mom's eyes, but your dad's nose." Helena smiled, remembering how Carlos had initially feared he wouldn't know how to be a father. Now, watching him patiently teach botany to his son, she saw a man who had found one of life's greatest joys in fatherhood. A movement to her right caught her attention. Isabel, 3 years old, walked unsteadily through the garden, her golden curls shining in the sun, her little hands outstretched trying to catch a butterfly that danced among the flowers. The girl had been born 2 years after Pedro, on a spring morning that had brought much less anxiety and much more pure celebration. "Mom!" Isabel shouted when she saw her at the window. "Pretty butterfly," Helena waved to her daughter, feeling her heart warm at the sight of those 2 little beings who had transformed her life in ways she never imagined possible. Carlos looked up and met Helena's gaze through the window. Even from a distance, she could see the smile that curved his lips, no longer the hesitant smile of the early days, but the expression of a man who was completely happy and fulfilled. The doorbell rang and Helena went to answer it, finding Joaquim at the gate. Her uncle had aged in recent years, but there was also a lightness in his expression that didn't exist during the time of financial difficulties. "Uncle Joaquim, what a pleasant surprise." "Helena, dear, I hope I'm not bothering you." "Never. Please come in." They went to the garden where Pedro immediately ran to greet his great-uncle, followed by Isabel, who was still chasing butterflies with adorable determination. "How's business?" Joaquim asked Carlos after the warm greetings. "It's prospering in ways I never imagined," Carlos replied, lifting Isabel into his arms when she finally gave up on the butterflies. "The small producers cooperative is generating profits for everyone involved, and we've discovered that doing good for others is also good for our own interests." "And Helena, how are your projects going?" Helena, who had just served lemonade for everyone, smiled modestly. "The orphanage now has a regular literacy program, and we're starting a training course for young women interested in independent work." "Nothing grand, but it is grand," Carlos interrupted with evident pride in his voice. "Helena is changing lives, one child at a time." Joaquim watched the family gathered in the garden, Pedro showing off his favorite plants, Isabel trying to teach a rag doll to walk, Helena and Carlos exchanging glances that still carried the tenderness of the early days, mixed with the complicity of the years lived together. "You know," he said, his voice laden with emotion, "when I arranged this marriage, I was just trying to solve financial problems. I never imagined I would be witnessing something so beautiful." Helena took her uncle's hand in hers. "Sometimes the best destinies come disguised as obligations. And sometimes," Carlos added, "the right people meet on the most improbable paths." When Joaquim left in the late afternoon, the family remained in the garden, enjoying the last rays of sun. Pedro had convinced Carlos to build a small fort out of twigs, and Isabel distributed imaginary flowers to everyone, insisting that they were special gifts. "Are you happy?" Carlos asked Helena as they watched the children play. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied. "And you?" "I feel as if I have lived several different lives. The man I was before I met you seems like a stranger now." Helena looked at her husband's face, seeing the soft marks that time and happiness had left on it. A few wrinkles around his eyes, more abundant silver threads at his temples, but a deep peace that transformed these changes into signs of beautiful maturity. "You know what surprises me the most," she said. "What?" "How we managed to build not just a marriage but a true partnership. We are different, we have different pasts, but we found a way to grow together. When it was time to put the children to sleep, they did it together, as was their nightly ritual." Pedro listened to a story about talking plants, told by Carlos with different voices for each character. Isabel slept in Helena's lap, lulled by a lullaby that Helena's mother used to sing. After the children fell asleep, Helena and Carlos sat on the balcony, watching São Paulo light up with the electric lights that now illuminated a large part of the city. "Sometimes I think," Helena said, "about the strange paths that destiny takes. If my parents hadn't died, if my relatives hadn't faced difficulties, if you hadn't decided it was time to marry again, none of this would have happened," Carlos completed. "But it did. And I am grateful for every circumstance, no matter how painful, that brought us here." Helena snuggled against his shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of his skin, mixed with the aroma of the jasmine that perfumed the night. "I love you," she said, simple and true. "I love you too," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "And I love the life we have built together." In the silent house, the children slept in peace, perhaps dreaming of butterflies and talking plants. In the garden, the medicinal herbs grew vigorously, promising cures for future ills. And on the balcony, a man and a woman who had met through the most improbable circumstances continued to write, day after day, a love story that had begun as an arrangement and had transformed into the most beautiful of choices. And so, in a São Paulo that was growing rapidly towards the future, Helena and Carlos discovered that the most beautiful marriages are not those that begin with overwhelming passion, but those that have the patience to let love grow slowly, solid and enduring, as the oldest trees, which face storms because their roots have intertwined deeply in the fertile ground of understanding, respect, and the daily choice to love.